Welcome to the first ever province-wide Seedy Saturday event. Bienvenue à la toute première fête de semences à l'échelle provinciale. My name is Madison Gerben, and I'm the Administrative Support and Indigenous Food Sovereignty Coordinator with Food for All New Brunswick. Food for All New Brunswick is a bilingual province-wide network with a vision of a New Brunswick that is informed, connected, and engaged in food security for all. We support food movements in New Brunswick by sharing information and resources, making cross-sectoral connections with food actors, and holding space for conversations on food issues. This is a re-recorded session from our Seedy Saturday event in February 2021. So let's roll up our sleeves with Shelley Shantz from La Ferme Hirondelle to get a head start on your 2020 garden plan. Shelley will share her home garden planning tips and guidance. We hope you have a pen and paper to take notes. A little background on our presenter today. Shelley and her husband Aaron bought an old farm and jumped into homesteading headlong with some naivety when they moved to New Brunswick 10 years ago. Through trial and error, and after working on various farms in British Columbia, Alberta, and New Brunswick, Shelley realized that the garden was where her passions lay. 4 years ago, the homestead transitioned into Hirondelle Farm, a market garden that grows for the Bucktouche Farmers Market, the Food Depot Alimentaire, and produces a small summer CSA. The farm also produces pasture-raised chickens for eggs and meat and makes all sorts of preserves from the garden. Shelley has 2 boys, Griffin and Clem, who join in on the farm when the wind blows just the right way. They also have an ever-changing number of livestock depending on what harebrained scheme Aaron has at the time. One exciting addition is a horse this spring. So, Shelley, take it away.
Okay, thanks so much for tuning in. I'm excited to share what I know about planting your garden. So we'll just get started here. I'm going to be doing a lot of screen sharing, so just bear with me here. Okay, so in planning your garden, what I'm going to talk about today is where to start. What type of garden maybe you'd want to look into, making use of time and space, which can be limited, and also starting seeds. So first of all, when planning your garden, you'll want to figure out what type of garden do you want. So one approach that you could look into if you're short on space is square foot gardening. So what it is a piece of land just divided into a square foot grid. So a benefit of small or square foot gardening is it's really good for small spaces. It's good for people with mobility issues. You can do a raised bed. You can, even if you're in a wheelchair or have trouble bending over, you can raise that bed and not have to bend over. It drains well and has low compaction because you're not walking around it. It's kind of safe in its raised bed there. There's no need for heavy garden tools. Really all you need is probably a hand shovel or a shovel. It requires less weeding because you're growing so much into a small space, the weeds are choked out and you really just have your vegetables. And it's also good for companion planting, which I'll talk a little bit more about too. Some downsides though for square foot gardening, it is expensive to start, especially if you are going to do that raised bed. The cost of lumber and then building, like bringing in that extra soil, it can be an upfront cost. But, and also it's limited to smaller plants. So some ideas for the square foot gardening and the planting guidelines. So you can see things like the root vegetables like carrots. The third from the left here on the top shows carrots. So in a square foot, you could squeeze 16 carrots into that square foot. Things like lettuce, 16 plants. This graphic is a 4 by 12 square foot. So you can see how much you really could squeeze into that small space. One downside though is you are limited with some of those bigger plants. So things like pumpkin, you could plant it in 1 square foot, but we know that it grows and spreads and it will take over your whole garden. So you really are limited in what plants you can grow, but you can still, if you have a small space, really produce quite a lot of your own food. So another approach would be row foot gardening. And this is what I do at our farm and in our garden. So for me, each row is 30 feet wide, and then the paths in between are 18 inches. Or sorry, 30-inch wide beds with 18-inch paths. So some benefits of this is that it really provides good drainage. So what I do when I'm building my garden or creating more beds is I'll kind of square off where my bed's going to be. And then I'll go down the path with a shovel and I'll dig out my paths and throw that soil onto the bed. So I'm creating raised beds myself. So a benefit of planting this way is that it does provide good drainage, especially if you're building up the soil. And it can provide higher yields because you're really squeezing a lot into that row, but it's not competing with many other plants. So the plants tend to thrive. They're not competing for sunlight or the nutrients or the water. So it's a really good approach to gardening. Some downsides though is that it does require a lot of space. You can see the space that's wasted with the paths in between, and you have to prepare the soil. So it might require some more hand tools, like maybe a broad fork, which is like a big fork that you put into the soil and pull back and it loosens the soil. And you also need a tiller. And you may need a tiller. It requires a lot more work and just to build up those beds. But one benefit is that then they're there. I might again have to go through the paths and just kind of throw more dirt onto the beds, but they're rich, and I add amendments to them every year too, and I'll talk a little bit more about that too. So I'm going to share another thing here. So if you're going to be doing that row foot gardening, this planting chart is from High Mowing Organic Seeds, and they're a company out of Vermont that sells organic seeds. So on their website or in their catalog, they have this planting chart, which is really beneficial. So you can see the one says row spacing. So that would be depending on how wide your actual bed is, that's how much space should be between each row. So for example, beans, they should be 18 to 30 inches apart in the rows. So in my 30-inch wide bed, I'm going to go with having my rows 18 inches apart. So I can fit 2 rows of beans in my larger 30-inch wide bed. So yeah, this just gives you a good visual. And then the plant spacing also says how far apart the seeds should be within the row. So another resource is a book called How to Grow More Vegetables in Small Space by John Jevons. And he has a spreadsheet that really shows how much you can squeeze plants closer together. So it's good to follow the seed package, but really they're being generous. You can put your plants a little bit closer together and they still will thrive. So back to the presentation here. So another approach to gardening, if you are expanding a garden that you already have, or you are starting from scratch, lasagna gardening is a really good approach to building up your soil and creating that good, rich bed. So what it is taking a lot of organic matter. So you can see from here, this visual, they say wet newspaper, compost, all sorts of compost, mushroom compost. I use seafood compost, manure, leaf mulch, wood ash, and you're layering it like a lasagna. Ideally, it would be good to do that the year before to plan ahead of your garden and to really prepare the soil and let it sit and decompose. But you could probably get, first thing in the spring, do that, put a tarp over it and see where you're at. Hopefully it will decompose in time for the season, but it's more something that would be better the year before. So for me, when we bought our property, we didn't move for another year to our property, but we came out to visit and I really wanted to get a jump start on my beds. So I put a little area aside, and I did this lasagna gardening, and I got leaf mulch from the curb from people, grass clippings, whatever I could find, and I layered it, cardboard too. And then the next year when we came back, that bed was the most beautiful bed I've seen. It was rich and lush and dark, rich soil full of worms. So yeah, I really recommend doing this approach if you're starting like on sod or on trying to transfer a garden into a bed. One thing I should say though is be careful with the cardboard. We have a lot of wind where we are, and we had chickens that we brought to our farm the first year, and they really liked to peck that cardboard. So between the wind and the chickens, we had cardboard everywhere. So it wasn't that good of a combination. So another thing to think about is garden rotation. So this could be year after year, planning, keeping track of what you plant, and then next year planning. The benefits of garden rotation is that it lessens the need for pest control. It reduces the spread of soil-borne diseases, and it also avoids the nutrient depletion in the soil because you're changing it up and really switching things around just to keep, you know, if you plant potatoes in the same year after year, the nutrients are going to get depleted, and also the potato bugs are just going to go crazy. So you want to have a little bit of variety. So some things to think about when you are doing a garden rotation. Companion planting. So this could be within the season. If you want to pick the plants that are benefits that different vegetables have. So some plants can repel insects just by their smell. Some can repel insects by exuding a certain chemical. Some they shelter beneficial insects. Some fix nitrogen and make that nitrogen available in the soil. And also some complement the flavor. For example, basil is said to be good to be planted beside tomatoes and peppers because it says it enhances the flavor of the tomatoes and peppers. But also, so it can be confusing to get just the right combination of companion planting, but it's interesting and fun kind of to plan your best garden based on companion planting. So another thing to think about is the nutrient needs. So within a season, it's good to figure out what are heavy feeders, light feeders, or heavy givers. So heavy feeders are those plants that really require a lot of nutrients and a lot of compost to thrive. So generally, they tend to be those vegetables that produce the vegetable or fruit above ground. The light feeders are ones tend to be like the root vegetables. And the heavy givers are beans, peas, those cover crops like vetch and clover, and they're nitrogen and make it available in the soil. So if I'm planting my garden and I know that I'm going to plant a heavy feeder, what I'll do is I have compost, and I'll layer that bed with 1/2 inch to 1 inch of deep of compost. And then I have crab meal, which is powdered lobster shells, and I'll just sprinkle it on top. And then I rake everything so that they're evenly spread over the bed. Some people will incorporate it into the soil with a tiller. Again, tillers are kind of controversial. If you do that deep tilling year after year, you're really actually depleting the nutrients in your soil. But every few years it's good to till. And so the heavy feeders, I'll put a compost and the crab meal. But the light feeders, I don't worry about the compost. What I do is I just sprinkle the crab meal on top, do a quick rake, and then I plant into my bed. For the heavy givers like beans and peas, I won't add anything to the soil. I'll just plant, and then as the season progresses and the plants grow, if they look like they're having trouble, then I might amend the soil and just add compost around each of the plants. So that's good to think about in each year. Think about what did you grow the year before? Was it a heavy feeder? So in that area, probably the next year, it would be good to then plant a light feeder. So that just makes sure that you're not really depleting the soil. So another thing to think about is fruit and vegetable families. So this graphic I found surprising for some vegetables and fruit. So that's another thing that I think about from year after year planting my garden, is that I want to switch up those family groups. So tomatoes and peppers are in the same nightshade family. So I'm not going to plant peppers one year and follow it by with tomatoes, because it's just, again, you're asking for a repeat of soil-borne diseases, insects, and you're depleting the nutrients. So it's good to think about those things as you're planting multiple years in your garden. So some space saving techniques, if that's a problem for you, some things to think about are vine varieties. So for example, tomatoes, squash, beans, cucumbers, they actually have ones that will grow more in a compact way and ones that will grow more like a vine. So for beans, bush beans, you can grow a lot in a small space. So I focus on bush beans. So within my 30-inch wide beds, I'll do 2 rows of bush beans planted 2 inches apart. And they just are very compact. I don't have to trellis them or even support them. Whereas pole beans, if you want to make use of vertical space, you could look into pole beans. So if you have a fence or maybe even the side of a wall that is facing south, you could look into doing pole beans. Another example is tomatoes. So the determinant tomatoes they tend to grow in a bush form. So they might need to be propped up, but they don't need to be trellised. They don't grow and spread out. And those tomatoes, they grow all at the same time and harvest usually around the same time. Whereas the indeterminate or vine tomatoes continue to grow throughout the season. So you'll have to trellis them and they just really branch out. So even things like cucumbers, melons, there are some varieties that grow in a more compact way. And it's worth, when you're researching what seeds to grow, to look at your catalog and to really find, like in the description, it should say if it grows more in a bush or compact way. And also if you want to make use of vertical space, you can grow some of the melons that produce smaller melons. So you could grow them vertically and trellis them and then maybe support. So again, if space is a problem, things like lettuce, spinach, the greens can all be squeezed closer together. If you have a flower garden, why don't you fill in those space with greens instead of having to weed and worry about that open space? Why don't you fill it with vegetables? And then also container gardening. So you can see with the middle picture here, the tires, they're growing potatoes. So they'll plant the tomatoes or the potatoes in the bottom tire. As they grow, add more soil, add another tire, and then at the end of the season, pull that all off, and it's a vertical space full of potatoes that isn't taking up space in your garden. So where we are, we have a very short growing season. So we want to try and maximize that short growing season the very best that we can. So one thing that you could do is look at the maturity date of some of the vegetables. So so there are different varieties of cabbage that have different maturity dates. So for example, the Red Express will mature in 63 days, the Famosa cabbage in 75 days, and then the late storage varieties can be 95 to even 120 days that it takes to mature. So if you want to really make use of your garden, there's a couple options that you could do. You could focus entirely on the short season cabbages, so the Early Express. You could plant a row of cabbages, and then maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, plant another batch of the Red Express. So you're going to have kind of a range of harvest throughout the season. Or you could get all 3 of these varieties, plant them all at the same time, and then as they mature, you're going to have different cabbages ready to harvest at different rates throughout your season. So the Red Express first, and then Formosa, and then the storage varieties, which will then be good. You can keep in a cold room and just really extend that season the best that you can. So another thing is succession planting. So two different ways that succession planting could work out. So one could be growing a different crop in the same space, one after the other in the same season. So the example given here is you could plant a row of carrots early in the spring. Then after you harvest them in early summer, you still have quite a bit of time before the first frost date in the fall. So you could plant a short growing crop to fill in that space. So you could, once the carrots are harvested, plant with snack beans and then have a harvest of beans before the fall. Or you could plant the same crop but in different parts of the garden in succession or at different times. So for example, maybe you want to plant radishes in section. My internet connection is unstable, so sorry if it's cutting out there. So for radishes, you could plant in one section, and then 10 days later, you could plant radishes somewhere else in your garden. And you can do that continually throughout the season, and then have a harvest of radishes all through the growing season. So I'm gonna share a few spreadsheets here, so just bear with me here. Okay, so this spreadsheet, I have people who sometimes ask, well, I don't really know when to start my seeds, outdoors or indoors. So this is a spreadsheet that I use, and I find it really helpful. So the key, it's an interactive spreadsheet that changes. So the key here is the last frost date. So for Moncton, I think it might be June 1st that the last frost generally happens in the spring. So I like to say June 10th, just to be sure. So you can see here, if I change this last frost date to May 24th, all these dates change. But I'm gonna go with June 10th. So if June 10th is your last frost date, it shows you here in column at the setting out date. So you can use this column if you don't want to start your seeds inside, just plant directly into the soil. You can use these dates to know. But if you really want to make use of your season, I would recommend very highly starting seeds inside. So I'm going to use broccoli as an example. So if I'm going to plant broccoli into the soil, direct seeding, I would do that around May 27th. Which is 2 weeks before the last frost date. So they're more cold hardy, you can plant those a little earlier. But if I want to make use and grow them inside, then it says I should plant them inside 4 to 6 weeks before the setting out date. So it's relative to this column. Broccoli inside between April 15th and April 29th. But if there's a range of weeks, I would always go with the longer. Instead of planting 4 weeks before, I would plant 6, just to be sure, because you don't know if you have a good soil mix, your light might be a problem, nutrients. I would just really go for the longer option. So that means I would plant my broccoli inside April 15th, and then I would transplant them May 27th. So I really find this helpful. You also, if there's not a crop here, you can add it and just add in the information that it needs. And I'll give my email at the end of the presentation, and if you ever want this spreadsheet, I'm totally happy to share it. So, if you're going to do the succession planting and you want to plant multiple plantings throughout the year, this also is a really good spreadsheet. So Johnny's Select Seeds is a great company for buying seeds. They're in the States. But on their website, they also have a whole section called, I think it's Interactive Library. So they have tons of different spreadsheets that can change depending on what your frost date is. like planting one, succession, how much seeds to actually plant, depending on how much harvest you want to have. So I definitely recommend looking at the Johnny's website. So for this one, this spreadsheet is dependent on your first fall frost date, whereas the last one was your last frost date. This is the first frost date. And again, for me, I put September 10th. I think it might be a little later, but I tend to find that the first frost happened September 10th where I am. So if you change that date, these will all change again. So depending on what your maturity, and that will say on your seed catalog. So we'll say beans are 55 days to maturity with the variety that I'm going to be planting. And I've decided that I want to plant the beans every 25 days. Again, if you change that, if you want it every 2 weeks, you just put that in and all the dates will change. So this first date, you're gonna get from the last spreadsheet what number you put for the interval between succession days. And then this final planting date is important because it's based on your first frost date. So this tells you the very last time in column M of when you can plant that crop. Because anything after that is probably not gonna mature. It will get dinged with the frost. I wouldn't plant past that date. So that's another good spreadsheet to look at. Wanting to really make use of the fall. This spreadsheet also is dependent on your first frost date, and it also tells you when is the last time that you can plant. So it's worth looking at these notes here, because if you have a hoop house or like a greenhouse, you can push those end dates a little bit longer because you're not really so worried about frost. But whereas planting inside really makes use of extending your harvest at the beginning of the season, these fall planting dates really push your season at the end. So we want to maximize our growing season the very best that we can. Okay, so that's the end of all those spreadsheets. I'll go back to my presentation here. So season extension, again, you can push those growing dates a little bit. And you can do that in a few different ways. So mulch, black mulch, put over the bed, or even a black tarp put on the ground ahead of the season will warm up the soil a little bit and might give you a few weeks of, so row covers, it's shown here in this bottom left picture, and row covers can be bought from Vessey's or even ordered through Suregain in Moncton, but they are really awesome, not only for protecting your plants from insects, but it also warms or keeps the plants a little bit warmer. So for me, my first planting of beans, let's say in the spring, I'll plant those beans and then I'll put a row cover over it and secure it down with like a metal hoops that you can get from the hardware store and just cut to the right length, and then held down with rock bags or sandbags. But that really keeps the plants protected. And then in the fall, for things like my melons, who are still producing in the first week of September, and I know there's a frost coming, I'm going to cover those up again. And it can protect plants up to -4 degrees. So that really pushes your growing season a little bit farther. Things like cold frames, which is the middle picture there, you can grow greens there all winter, really. If it's facing south, then you can maybe protect inside with straw. So that really extends the winter. And then of course, hoop houses and high tunnels and greenhouses will all help too. A little bit more costly, but they can be done on a smaller scale. Even within a long bed, you could kind of like this look with the row covers, the bottom left picture, you could cover that with plastic, do a smaller scale greenhouse. and really extend your season a little bit farther. So for starting seeds, if you do want to go down that route, it also can be done quite cheaply. So the upper right picture shows my setup. So it's a metal shelf that I get from Costco. It has, I think, room for 6 shelves. I'll only do 5. And then I'll get shop lights from, I think Kent Building Supplies has them, and they're the exact length of my shelves. So each shop light holds 2 bulbs, and so I'll do 2 shop lights per shelf, and each shelf holds 4 trays. So each shelf will have 2 shop lights, 4 bulbs. So this whole setup, I can fit 16 trays, and I can probably do all of that for maybe $300. So it's definitely worth investing. So this picture here on the bottom is trays. So I'll plant my seeds into these trays, which also can be bought cheaply at MacArthur's or whatever. Other growing, the growing co-op in Moncton, you can order them online, but they're really worth using because you can fit a lot into a tray. So the picture here is a 72 cell tray. So 72 cells in one tray with a shelf times 4, like you can fit quite a bit. And then as the plants grow, I'll raise the grow lights. So they're hanging from the shelf above them with chains. And I'll try and keep those lights probably about 4 inches above the tray. So as the plants grow, I'll raise them up a little bit more. And then eventually I can transplant them into the garden. I'll harden them off, like I'll put them outside just to get used to the outside and bring them back in. And then things like tomatoes, peppers, melons, I will have to repot into bigger plants or bigger pots, but they also can fit on these shelves and you can fit a lot in. So I definitely recommend looking at this because you can have it inside, it's warm, you're just providing the best environment for your plants to really have a head start. They're hardy and they're healthy as they go into the garden, which gives you a real jump start on the season. So that's what I have today to present to you. Again, no matter what size your garden, if it's a balcony garden or even just containers on a porch or a backyard garden, any food that you're growing for yourself is helping your food security. It is making you less reliant on the food system, which we have seen this past year to be very unstable. So no matter what size of garden that you're doing, anything is, just a real benefit to yourself and to the community. So thanks so much for tuning in. And yeah, this is my email here. So if you have any more questions or would like any of those spreadsheets sent to you, feel free. So thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Shelley. That was awesome. That was every time like I hear about gardening things, my mind goes crazy. I tried last year to have my first garden. Well, I had even bought a whole bunch of plants from you, but then I had squash beetles and cucumber beetles just totally like demolish my whole, like half of my garden was squash, right? Because I was trying to save it for the winter.
Oh, that's so frustrating.
And I didn't even know what to do. But I feel like if I would have had this type of presentation last year, then I maybe would have known how to deal with it a little bit better. So hopefully this year everything goes a little bit more smooth. So I'd like to just I'd like to thank you for your time and willingness to share all this with New Brunswick. And it'll be shared across all corners of the province. So I'm sure everyone can benefit from it in some aspect for their own gardens at home. And I'd like to let everyone know that some of these resources mentioned, they'll be linked to Food for All's resource directory and the garden landing page. So if you see in the description below of this recording, there'll be links to other resources. You're welcome to join the Food Gardening in New Brunswick Facebook group that we have, linked through Food for All's Facebook page. And we have food gardening video playlists on our YouTube for more content made in New Brunswick. And you're welcome to subscribe to our pages to get more frequent updates. And I'd like to give everyone some good luck for their gardening adventures. They'll probably be starting to plant soon. So thank you again, Shelley, so much for your patience and for a great presentation.
Thank you.